Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Joti Brar, and we got a lot to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Joti Brar. You will forgive us for being a few moments late. Had a few technical difficulties, but we were able to work our way through that. Joti, welcome back.
Thanks, Garland.
All right, we got a number of things going on, but let's start off with this. And I think we have to start off here. The U.S. is again threatening Iran because anything could happen right now. The U.S. is threatening Iran. I think the U.S. is and Israel, U.S./Israel. But I think they're a little wary because Iran is far stronger than anything that they have run up against, and it has the ability to to launch a devastating reprisal. Your thoughts on the current state of affairs between the U.S. and Iran, and you got to add in all the media that the media was so exposed, all of that stuff.
Definitely, thanks, Garland. Well, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is the complete failure of what was a kind of multi-dimensional, multi-front regime change operation. We saw it was like a rerun, but almost on steroids of what happened at the beginning of the 12-day war, wasn't it? So at the beginning of the 12-day war, we saw pretty much exactly what was done in just a few hours in Venezuela. Now, in Venezuela, they didn't follow that up with bombing or an invasion, but the initial steps were exactly the same. So obviously a huge amount of threatening and misinformation in the media sphere, and then an attack on the electricity, on the information systems, a decapitation of as many of the leaders as they could pinpoint. And we know that they tried to either kill or kidnap the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran. They were successful in killing many scientists and many military leaders. But alongside that kind of attack on all of Iran's systems, so that includes, of course, trying to jam their air defense systems and jam the military communication systems. And we know that in the first 24 hours in Iran, back in June, they were successful in jamming all those systems, right? So it's not only Venezuela this has been done to successfully. They successfully did that to Iran for some hours, right? And they expected that combined with activating a lot of sleeper agents in the country would kind of push, create chaos in the country and enable the bombing to be carried out in such a way that it kind of forced a regime change. What happened back in June was that the Iranian government actually recovered from the initial onslaught very quickly. And by 24 hours in, they were back on the front foot, and they were able to send bombing raids into Israel. And it was a like-for-like bombing. So they made it very clear at that time, they were on defensive footing. They were responding to attacks. Every attack on Iran had a responding attack in Israel. And they showed, look, we can give you back like for like. We have more missiles and more capabilities than you realize. And this will escalate as far as you escalate it. That was the stance that they took back last June. But this time round, we've seen another attempt at activating a whole load of sleeper cells inside Iran. So there were clearly more sleepers, more Mossad agents, more imperialist sleeper cells in Iran than were uncovered last time around. Because, of course, last time there was a whole load of arrests of sleeper cells. And we thought that kind of layer of activists had been wiped out, if you like. But clearly, either they weren't all caught or a lot more have infiltrated since. Or potentially a bit of both. But I think some of these cells that have now been exposed have been active in Iran or waiting in Iran actually for quite a long time. And this was really a regime change op where they threw everything at it. So there was a huge media campaign. They jumped on the back of protests that were raised by, a section of the Iranian population, particularly bazaar merchants, who were really hit hard by a collapse in the currency. And of course, the collapse in the currency is part of this hybrid war, right? Because it was engineered from outside by economic warfare of the imperialists. So it wasn't something inherent that, just happened because the leaders of Iran are really terrible at economics and planning, and they're just so corrupt and awful, which is the narrative that the Western media push, just as they've pushed that narrative in Venezuela, that the results of their economic warfare are in fact incompetence by a government that is, doesn't take care of its people. It's exactly the opposite, right? The government's doing its best to protect its people from the results of this economic warfare, but sometimes it's simply not possible. So we had this engineered collapse of the currency. You had a spontaneous protest movement that was very quickly hijacked by violent terrorist infiltrators, right? We have to be very clear about that. It was extremely terroristic violence that was unleashed on the streets across Iran. And the idea, again, was to create chaos, confusion, and social upheaval, and to spin it in the minds of the people that their governments lost control and they need to either assist in regime change or be passive while regime change is enacted for their own good, because they're only going to get more chaos and more violence if this is left to carry on. The media in the West spun it that the violence on the streets was the Iranian government, when in fact it was Mossad, the CIA, MI6, it was the Western intelligence agencies and their assets who were violent, who were there with arms and shooting, is sometimes at random, just to cause chaos. As we know in the case of, some small children, random old people who were just murdered, to help push this sense of chaos and unsafety, insecurity in the streets. A lot of police personnel and various state forces were targeted and killed while they were trying to do their job of trying to keep the streets safe. So the Western media was busy pretending that every death was in fact the government randomly firing on peaceful protesters to help spin their narrative of, we're going to have to intervene, something's going to have to be done. And then you had this attempt again to kind of jam Iranian communications. But what was really impressive in the way the Iranian government responded, and I'm sure that, I don't have insider information, but it looks pretty likely to me that there's been a coming together of countries in the axis of resistance globally. My guess is Russia or China or both stood behind Iran and helped them, transferred technologies to them that enabled them not only to close down the Iranian local internet to kind of stop the spread of misinformation, which of course, the imperialists, it's part of how they engender the mood for regime change operations and confuse the people and demoralize them. But they were also able then to pinpoint the holders of Starlink equipment, which Mossad has been giving out to all its agents in Iran. I'm sure your people have covered this before, but it's really important to note that this ploy was basically defeated by the Iranian government, which was able to, first of all, detect where all the Starlink users were and then close it down. So they actually closed down this regime change operation. They stopped it in its tracks. They have identified and arrested a whole layer of agents. I hope it's as maximal as possible. My understanding is they did everything they could to get those people to show themselves by letting Starlink run for a little while before they closed it down. So they got the locations of a lot of agents and have been able to arrest them. So that makes future operations along these lines very difficult, if not impossible. And essentially now the narrative of we're coming in, we have to bomb to protect, you know, the protesters, the peaceful protesters, has kind of been shot out of the water. This approach to regime change has been defeated. And now, you know, the Zionists and their imperialist backers remain as desperate as ever to bring down Iran. They need to control Iran's oil wealth. They need to stop the access of resistance, and so they have full control of the whole of the oil wealth of the Middle East, which is in fact continuing to slip out of their grasp. But the difficulty for them is, back in June, the Iranians made it clear, you know, they haven't created instability and upheaval and chaos in the ranks of the military or in the leadership of the country, which was a prerequisite really for them to launch their bombing campaign. Now, if they launch it, Iran is, as they like to say, locked and loaded. They're ready, they're prepared, they have everything they need to respond. And they made it clear last June. Back in June, they took a defensive posture and they answered strike for strike. They didn't do all the things they could have done in terms of destroying Israel's military and civilian infrastructure and trade infrastructure, economic infrastructure. They didn't do all the things they could have done in terms of targeting the bases of US imperialism all over the Middle East. But what they said was, if this war is restarted, we will be moving from a defensive to an offensive position. And they've reiterated that position, haven't they, the leaders of Iran? Recently, they're saying, if you are so foolish as to unleash another bombing campaign against us, we will be going onto an offensive footing. And you better watch out for all of your bases and for the oil industry across the Middle East. We'll close the Straits of Hormuz. We'll do all the things we didn't do last time, but which we are perfectly able to do. So the USA has put itself in quite a quandary. On the one hand, the imperialists really need to bring down Iran, and they're not going to stop trying. On the other hand, the coming together, I really believe that Iran has been bolstered, that despite the damage that was done to it last June, it's been bolstered by the solid solidity of its alliance with both Russia and with China, with whom both of which, of course, it shares borders. So it's not like they're very far away. It's not logistically, it's really hard for Russia and China to support Iran. They're right there. And they have, both Russia and China have made it clear on the global stage diplomatically that they stand with Iran, that these attacks on Iran are illegal, that Iran is a very important ally to them, and they will continue to be in support in every way possible. And I think that, you know, the operation against Starlink and the bringing down of that network of Mossad activists is a real proof of that.
Let me ask you this before we move on, because I did want to do this. You know, it's interesting the contradictions that are really glaring now from the imperial countries, not the least of which being Donald Trump says, yes, sir, if you do anything to those protesters, we've got to do something to protect the protesters. And there's protesters in like Minneapolis in the US, and they're literally just grabbing people, shooting them, shooting some woman driving around in an SUV. Now they heave some guy to the ground, take his gun, some officers running away with his gun, and they shoot him in the back like 10 times. You know, this contradiction that I'm like, don't you even hear yourself? Anyway, your thoughts on what appears to be the war on terror in Minneapolis.
It's horrific, actually, isn't it, Garland? And, you know, we have to understand that these things are connected. I've heard you talk about, and it's something that we used to say often back in the days of the anti-terror laws, the way they were used in the north of Ireland back in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And we used to say, if you allow these laws on the statute book, number one, they'll never be taken off, which they haven't been. Number two, they'll eventually be used against you here on the island of Britain. And of course, now they are being. And I've heard you talk about that. You know, when you allow your own ruling class to dehumanize people abroad and use these fascistic measures against them, they are practicing, they're in training for when they need to do those things back at home. And eventually it's coming back home to bite you. And you, in many respects, you have no one to blame but yourselves that you've allowed them to build up this capability and knowledge and sat back and go, oh, nothing to do with me, that's foreign affairs, and taken your bribe and lived your nice life and put your blinkers on. And that is exactly what we're seeing today. All of this comes back to the global economic crisis of capitalism. The financial crisis is getting worse and worse and worse. And the desperation that engenders in the ruling class is on two fronts. Number one, it pushes them to war. They're trying to resolve their systemic crisis by seizing enough assets abroad that can, give a boost back to the system and give them a reset and bring back some profitability for a time. The other thing is they're unable to deliver the level of bribe to the workers at home that they're used to. And that means there's dissatisfaction and social unrest at home. And because they can't bribe their way out of that, what do? They're turning increasingly to fascistic repression. And we are seeing the building up of all the forces necessary for fascism in our home countries. And I think we have to be very cognizant of the fact that it was the left so-called, like the Democrats, the Labour Party, who have been the handmaidens to this process. They are absolutely a part of facilitating the build-up of all these forces, of this legislation, of this environment, of gradual reduction of civil liberties, and in particular, the promotion of culture wars and divide and rule narratives, especially anti-immigration narratives, to, number one, keep the people fighting amongst themselves, to keep a section of the people cheerleading for every new fascistic measure because it's presented as for their protection, when in fact it's for the protection of the tiny monopolist financier elite whose system is having a meltdown and who are trying to retain their control over the system and over the working class in very difficult conditions. But yeah, so on the one hand, we have all of these means of intimidation. On the other hand, we have this, as you said, more and more blatant hypocrisy. And that's another reason for the need for internal repression, because the hypocrisy is so blatant now, with the system so decaying and decrepit and so unable to cover the truth about itself. More and more openly rabid activities at home and abroad, that the hypocrisy is impossible for anybody who pays any attention to ignore. And therefore the cynicism is on the rise. The trust in all the institutions of the state is plummeting so fast amongst bigger and bigger sections of the population. And that is part of why they need intimidation, because they can't bribe us off to look the other way. Those of us who are waking up are increasingly angry and really wanting to see genuine systemic change, and losing faith in the idea we can vote for something different when we see how the bipartisan politics works, how the two-party system brings you the same policies no matter who you vote for. So these things go together. And I think on top of all of this, we have to look at the role of the fake left, the people who call themselves socialists and communists in the left, in the West, overwhelmingly are not. Overwhelmingly, they're social democrats. They're the left end of the Labour Party, the left end of liberalism, the left end of the Democrats. And they play this role actually while pretending to oppose, Trump's fascism or whatever they might say. What do they do in a crisis like the one during the regime change operation against Iran? They're all there amplifying the lies of the psychological operation of the imperialists, demonizing the very leadership of the nation which is on the front line against the ruling class they claim also to oppose. And they come out with these, Trotskyite formula constantly that, you know, oh, neither one nor the other, neither Washington nor Moscow. That's what the Trotskyists used to say in the days of the Soviet Union. Today they say neither Tehran nor Washington. You know, we support the Iranian, some abstract Iranian working class, right? That it's always an abstract force that they support, not an existing one. If you go and look at Iran today, the masses of the popular sentiment is with the Islamic Republic. Even amongst progressive people who are not at all religious and would like to see a government in Iran that is not religious too. At this point in time, given what's happening, the mass of the people recognize that the essence of their government is not, in fact, religion, but sovereignty, independence, anti-imperialism. And that is why they support it. It is, in fact, a government that does its best to bring them development, to use the country's wealth to the benefit of the country. It has brought tremendous benefits and modernization to Iran over the last 40 years, and has withstood a huge amount of imperialist aggression, economic warfare, military warfare. You know, Iran has suffered hugely for taking the decision to be a sovereign nation. And the people have endured a lot to defend that sovereignty and develop their country as an independent state. And they continue to do so. And that's the basis on which people really, the mass of the people are in solidarity and in support of their government and their system, despite, you know, lots of differences that lots of them may have internally. Those differences are for Iranians. But the essence of the matter for us from the West is to support the government, which is genuinely fighting imperialism on the front line. And it's disgusting to me to see how many parties that call themselves communist and socialist are out there repeating lies of the imperialists without any hesitation and condemning the government of Iran on the basis that it's theocratic, as if, you know, that sums up its essence. And this is a really un-Marxist, undialectical approach to the struggle against imperialism, which is very disgusting to see, because, of course, in the end, all it does is promote regime change narratives and, from the left, normalize the activities and the justifications of the imperialists for their aggression.
You know, I think you hit the nail on the head when it came to the issues of economics driving this drive to war, driving a lot of this attempt to, you know, expand and to access the violently access the natural resources of Iran and Venezuela. But you missed something. The reason is aliens. Bank of England warns alien disclosure could crash the economy. A potential US, so there you go. We've got a AI kind of looking alien right there. A former Bank of England analyst, so you know we can trust that person because they're a former Bank of England analyst. That gives them all of the street cred, the gravitas. Has issued a stark warning, quote, if the White House officially confirms the existence of aliens, the global economy could face catastrophic disruption. Now, I will say this. I have thought about, I'm not an economist, but I thought about that, contemplated that, and I thought, how? I mean, if I'm watching TV and Trump comes on and says, hey, you know, like the old Dave Chappelle thing, hey, there's aliens, and this is my friend Bibble. Bibble, this is everybody. Hi, Bibble. And off he goes. What, am I going to suddenly run to the bank? Oh, my God, that's Bibble. I'm going to run to the bank. I got to take all my money out. Gold is going to crash. Everything's going to crash because he's standing next to Bill. I don't see how. So I just thought, well, maybe I should just read the part where the Bank of the Bank of England expert warns that something, we're not going to call it aliens, could, quote, crash the global economy. Perhaps they're trying to blame it on Bibble. Poor Bibble.
So unfair. You know, Garland, you've put your finger on it. You know, if you take out the part about aliens, that actually tells you something very significant, which is the Bank of England, and no doubt others, are preparing the ground, preparing us for the fact, and you know, they're also preparing their experts to work out, they're trying to figure out a strategy for an impending economic meltdown that they have been trying to get a handle on through all these wars since the beginning of the SMO, right? Remember, the launch of their special military operation in Ukraine was a defensive operation by Russia when the NATO armies were massing on the borders of the Donbass. It was a war that had been provoked, a regime change operation that was aimed at Russia by NATO and particularly by the Anglo-Americans, with the aim of bringing down the independent and sovereign government of Russia and replacing it with a stooge regime that would allow them to balkanize and loot the vast territory of the Russian Federation. That was their aim. And they thought with that looting bonanza, they would be able to stabilize their system for long enough to then take on China. And that will give them, you know, if they could bring China down and do the same to that, balkanize it and loot it, that would give them the reset they need. They are facing an economic Armageddon right now. And they're trying to pretend that's not the case. But the war drive is increasingly desperate, and this is why. And each time one of the wars fails in its aim, what we end up with is that the situation they're trying to escape is being exacerbated. Look at what happened economically, not only to Europe, but to the whole imperialist camp when the sanctions against Russia backfired. It was supposed to be a short-term pain for a long-term gain, and instead they have had longer and longer term pain, more and more pain being suffered primarily by Europe, but actually by the whole imperialist camp. And so now they're more desperate. They're trying to get there. Okay, they come around a different way, you know, but essentially the war drive is becoming more desperate because the economic situation is more desperate. And this financial meltdown is becoming more and more imminent. And the mechanisms for trying to get around it are running out. So we see this particularly with the, you know, they've been stoking this AI bubble and trying to pretend that everything's brilliant in the US economy because, you know, watch this bubble go up. And this means we're still the kings of the world and the kings of high technology and all the rest of it. And of course, it doesn't mean any such thing. It's another sign of the global overproduction crisis. And with this impending meltdown on the horizon, I think they are trying to get a narrative ready to explain what's happened, probably to justify another whole load of money printing on a scale that nobody's ever seen before, and all of the economic pain that goes with that, because of course it brings huge inflation, which we're already suffering from globally. But isn't it interesting that on the one hand, the sense that they're running out of road in terms of kicking the can down the road is impelling them to prepare the people as well as the expert responders for the likelihood of this meltdown. And on the other hand, that with all of the think tankocracy at their disposal, right? With all these paid professionals whose job it is to come up with strategies and narratives, what they seem to be landing on is aliens. Now, there's a part of you that just says, how absurd, how ridiculous. But there's another part of you that thinks, you know, we've been primed, haven't we? Populations in the West have been primed for decades to accept that if a US president comes out and says, we can, you know, NASA can confirm that after decades of, you know, scientific research, we can now confirm the existence of intelligent extraterrestrial life that poses a grave threat to humanity or whatever. We've watched so many movies where that happens, right? We've watched so many episodes of the X-Files, whatever, that we're primed to believe that A, that could happen, B, if it does happen, America's the natural leader of the world. You know, you can definitely see a way in which, you know, Hollywood massaging of the general ignorance and propagandized nature of the population could convince a section of the population that, oh, I knew it all along, this is true. You know, there's a section of the internet that's been devoted to, all the things they're not telling you about the aliens, for a long time, hasn't there? And that will explode. Like, this is, people have been talking about this for decades. It's really true. So you can see a very good mechanism for convincing a bunch of people to fall in behind the government, whatever measures they announce they need to take, for convincing a lot of the populations of the West to fall back in behind America, whatever measures they say they have to take, whatever they say they have to do. If they can point to, it's the aliens, right? There'll be some people who will go along with that and think it makes sense. I would like to draw a parallel. It's not quite so absurd, but at the time of the stock market crash in February to March 2020, this was also done to us in a different way. A narrative was constructed to hide from public view the fact that our governments printed, or our banks printed, millions, billions of pounds and dollars to bail out the stock market. And we were told it was to bail out the people. We were told that the COVID bailout and all the COVID money printing was to save the people in a health emergency. But actually, if you look at the timeline, what you see is lockdowns didn't happen when they might have been effective as a localized measure to stop the spread of the virus early on. They, as in the words of Boris Johnson, they let it rip, right? It was already endemic across the population when the first lockdown happened. Actually, if you look at the timing of the first lockdown, it coincided with the crash in the stock market. And the bailout was overwhelmingly a bailout of the stock market. We were told small businesses and ordinary workers are being bailed out, but it was a narrative constructed to hide the bailing out of the biggest monopolies on the stock market, which were having a massive crash, right? That's it. That's it. You need that.
Just the mention of COVID makes me want to flatten it. I'm trying to flatten the curve.
Brilliant. So,
but,
so they have form on this, right? Ever since 2008, because people will no longer accept that bailing out the banks is a necessary measure, that the banks are too big to fail, because they know now that the consequences are inflation, austerity, we're paying forever, and the banks get away scot-free with the fact that, they're too big to fail, apparently, but the ordinary people are not. And we all know that, the huge numbers of people who have died directly in our countries as a result of austerity policies, which were carried out to fund the paying for the bailout of the banks in 2008. So directly announcing something like that, honestly saying we're going to bail out the banks again, that would cause social unrest. So they have to have other stories when they're doing it. Sometimes they just do it behind closed doors, like they did with those three Silicon Valley banks kind of melted down a couple of years ago. And they kind of very quietly said this was happening on a Friday. And then over the weekend, the news just went away. And essentially what happened was every dollar in every one of those banks was guaranteed by the state. Enough money was printed to solve the problem. Nobody lost any money. There was no panic. There was no infection to the rest of the system. And it was quietly glossed over. But these problems are endemic at this point to the system. There is so much bad debt in the system. There is so much speculation. And the inflated values of assets in which people speculate compared to the reality of the real economic activity underneath is so out of proportion. Everybody can see now, who's paying attention, of course, that the AI stock prices are a massive bubble. And anybody who understands economics understands this is a symptom of a deep and deepening underlying economic crisis, to which the ruling class has no resolution apart from win its war against a very big country abroad and steal, loot all of its resources. That's its only method for trying to restabilize at this point. But I do think the fact that with all their resources, the narrative they're choosing to kind of go with or seriously considering, we'll see, won't we? When it actually happens, we'll see if that is the one they go with. But the fact that they're priming that in public now tells you it's under serious consideration, right? And this to me is a sign of the weakness of the system as a whole. that that's the best they can do, and that's something they seriously consider, despite the fact that surely, in the eyes of so many people, that's going to have so little legitimacy. Who would really give that credence? That, you know, straight out of a 1950s B movie, isn't it?
It's absurd. And just before we move on, just so people will know what Joti was talking about, there were two banks. One of them was called Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, that crashed a year or so ago. And it might have been 2 years, but the basically what Silicon Valley Bank was doing, it was just like 2008 in a way. What they were doing was this. They can loan out 20 to 1. For every dollar they have, the government says you can loan $20, which actually makes the bank automatically insolvent, because if everybody comes back for their money, they're going to be 20 times short. But at any rate, so here's what they would do. So if they have $1 billion, they can loan out 20 billion, right? Okay, so here's what they would do. Joti, wouldn't you like to start up at Silicon Valley? Wouldn't you like to start up an AI company? Yes, I would. Here's what we'll do. We'll loan you $1 billion, but there's one rule. We'll loan you $1 billion. You have to keep it in our bank. So Joti says, okay, all right, Joti, now we're going to take $1 billion of our money and we're going to loan it to you. And then we're going to put it in an account in our bank and we're going to go, look, we just got another $1 billion. We can loan that out 20 to 1. So they just take the money out of one account, put it into another one, and then claim that they've got income. And now they loan out to that. It was just but why wouldn't they? Because this is just what you do on Wall Street with Wall Street banks. I mean, it's not. And then it fell apart. And rather than going after them for deliberately going around the law, for deliberately violating the law, they just bailed them out. If it was you and I, would go to jail for violating the law, they bail them out. Now, let's move on to something important. And I think it is very, very important, as a person who recently went to St. Petersburg, what's now St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad, it was Stalingrad, I think it was Petrograd at one time. It was, yes. But the bottom line is, I went to a number of the museums from the siege of Leningrad, and I saw all kinds of stuff there. It was great. It was really awesome. And I didn't realize today isn't today an anniversary regarding Leningrad?
Yes. So in 1944, on the 27th of January, Leningrad was liberated finally after a siege that lasted nearly 900 days. Now that was, we'll talk about it in a minute, because the other day that it is today is the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And that's because on the same day, 27th of January, 1945, so 1 year later, the Red Army again liberated Auschwitz concentration camp. Now, the siege of Leningrad is a part of the Nazi genocide that people don't often talk about. But in fact, I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers to hand with me, and it's not right to get them wrong, but I'm sure it was over 1 million Soviet people, overwhelmingly civilians, died in that siege. If you've ever seen documentary footage about what happened, the conditions that people endured, they were absolutely horrific. And yet the Soviet people stood out for, the best part of 3 years in that siege. They were truly heroic in withstanding this assault. And the Soviet armed forces were also heroic in trying to keep some supply lines open, trying to bring, across frozen lakes, trying to hold open a bit of a supply line despite the almost total encirclement of the city. And that was a scene of fierce fighting and of fierce resistance by the people of Leningrad, as it was, and will be again, I'm sure, for all of that time. And it was one of the epic struggles of World War II, which too many young people today don't know anything about. They don't learn about it in their history books. They don't understand the sacrifices the Soviet people made to defeat German Nazi fascism, and what a toll that took on the entire population. So it's a very significant day in the history of World War II, in the history of the struggle against fascism. And I think there's something very, what's the word I'm looking for? there's a resonance about the fact that that also was the 1 year later, it was the same date, something very poignant about the fact that on the same date a year later, the Auschwitz liberation camp was liberated by the Red Army, and the crimes, the extent of the genocidal, systemic genocidal crimes of Nazi fascism were revealed to the world, a horrified world, right? And we have this whole thing about never again, no more Holocaust. But of course, those of us who understand the system of imperialism understand that, in fact, the really horrific thing about the Nazi Holocaust was not that its uniqueness, but the fact that it was one in a long string of horrific Holocausts carried out by imperialist powers over, and when colonial powers before them, over hundreds of years. And almost every colonized part of the world has suffered its own Holocaust once or sometimes multiple times in the history of the last few hundred years. And this is something really important, I think, because if you really want to say never again to such atrocious and horrific anti-people crimes as the Nazi Holocaust of World War II, then you have to be fighting imperialism. You have to be an active anti-imperialist. It's the only way never again can mean anything. We see all our politicians, don't we, lining up and lighting candles and posting pictures of themselves on social media, lighting their candle and saying never again, and talking about the World War II Holocaust as if only Jews died, when, of course, although Jews were systematically slaughtered when they came under the occupation of the Nazis, it wasn't only Jews, and Jews weren't even the largest actually segment of that Holocaust, because there were far more Russians died than anybody at the hands of the Nazis. But setting that aside, the way it's talked about, like Jewish suffering has been the only suffering, actually it belittles the very real suffering of the Jews, because to treat it in this ahistorical way means not to really want to understand the crime and stop it in the future, but to use it as a weapon, as part of today's propaganda war. And of course, we know the weaponization of the Holocaust is about using the suffering of Jews in World War II to justify crimes against and suffering of the Arab people in the modern world, using the proxy force of Zionism. But fundamentally, it's an imperialist crime, and we must never forget that. But this weaponization of Judaism, turning it into Zionism, Zionizing Judaism, and this weaponization of the suffering of Jews in World War II during the Holocaust, or during that Holocaust, weaponizing that to place Zionism, not Jews, to place Zionism on a pedestal that you are not allowed to attack, because any criticism of Zionism has now been recast as anti-Semitism, as Holocaust denial, as not appreciating the particular and specific and special and unique suffering of the Jewish people, which is a political narrative used by the imperialists to brainwash us and to justify their crimes, ongoing criminality in the Middle East. This is very, very important for us. If we really care about stopping Holocausts, we cannot allow the weaponization of one Holocaust to justify the perpetration of another Holocaust, can we? And this, right now, this is a live issue, isn't it, Garland? And if I may, can I talk very briefly about our campaign over here?
Sure.
So this ties in directly to the weaponization of definitions of what is anti-Semitism, right? So again, as part of their war effort to control the resources of the Middle East, Zionism and the proxy force of the Zionist population in Israel have been created as an armed outpost of imperialism to threaten, intimidate, and hold down the peoples of the Middle East and keep control for the imperialist monopolies of Middle Eastern oil reserves. And as part of their propaganda campaign, weaponizing the Holocaust is one plank of that. Weaponizing the concept of anti-Semitism is another one. And what has been done is this creation of definitions of anti-Semitism, which go beyond the idea that, you know, we won't get into who are the Semites, but let's accept that when you say anti-Semitism, you mean hatred of Jews. Well, today, the official definitions, not the sensible dictionary definition, but the official definition of anti-Semitism in the West now includes any criticism of Israel or the Israeli state. So what does that mean? That means that criticizing Israel, criticizing Zionism, which is a fascist ideology, let us not forget, a supremacist, racist ideology which justifies the dehumanization of and genocide against another population, criticizing that ideology, criticizing the state which embodies that ideology, criticizing the crimes carried out in the name of that ideology, and criticizing or opposing the genocide that's being conducted today against not only Palestinians, but in particular Palestinians in the Middle East, all those activities become anti-Semitism and are increasingly being criminalized. And in Britain today, we have this definition of anti-Semitism has been concocted by a group that was brought into existence about a decade ago called the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. And their definition is the one which includes all of these examples, and all the examples are basically basically conflating anti-Zionism and anti-Israel speech and activity with anti-Semitism, i.e. hatred of Jews. And this definition is not a law in Britain, but it's become like a law because a whole load of state organizations have adopted it as their measure for deciding whether an employee is anti-Semitic or isn't. So by councils, schools, universities, and now the entirety of the National Health Service, which employs, you know, if you include all the contracted out people, probably about 2 million people in Britain, right? Britain's biggest employer is the health service. Now, if that was adopted by Wes Streeting, our health minister, who's a Labour Party health minister, I'll just remind everybody, this is the role of the left, right? The Labour Party health minister, who is known to be well funded by the Zionist lobby, amongst other things. So he's a very loyal servant of imperialism and a proponent of Zionism, supporter of Israel. He adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into the entirety of the health service without any consultation back at the tail end of last year. And so a group has been founded called Right to Protest, which is being headed up by my comrade Joti Brar, and he and other activists and a bunch of activist lawyers are working hard to bring a judicial review of this decision. So they're trying to use legal means, but we need to mobilize as workers. We need to mobilize in the anti-war movement, in the Palestine solidarity movement, in the health campaign groups, in our trade unions. This is an outrage. It is a justification for it. It's a whitewashing of Zionist genocidal crimes. It's also a massive attack on the freedom of speech of ordinary British people. If it's allowed to stand, it will just be quietly rolled out across the whole of our society, as it has been being. But this is a really big and very important kind of test case. And I would ask people to help with the fundraising for the legal costs, if they can, for this particular case. But more importantly, actually, than the legal case, is mobilizing, you know, in your workplaces, in your trade unions, whether or not you work in the health service concerns you, right? And everybody should be mobilizing to stop this attack on civil liberties and stop this whitewashing of genocidal crimes and the British ruling class's complicity and involvement in those crimes.
Yeah, it's what you're saying is critical. So people, where can people go if they want to, support these actions and movement?
Thank you. I don't have the URL to hand right now, but if you look up Right to Protest. They've got a crowdfunder going. I'll send you the link, Garland. Maybe you could put it up under the show afterwards. And I'll post the link on my Telegram channel again. But Right to Protest, and they have a crowdfunder for legal costs that's kind of running right now.
Let me see if I. The British anti-Israel group into IRHI definition adoption. Okay, the Jerusalem Post.
Yeah,
they're talking about it.
They've rattled a cage or two there, haven't they?
Yes. Oh, I see a video with your brother, NHS surgeon, an activist cleared over Zionism literature arrest. Oh, yes, that's right. When they were arrested for the Zionism literature, they've been, to me, seeing a crackdown implies something, right? When you see the government start to crack down on something, it implies an area of weakness. I will defend my areas of weakness. It's like if someone, self-defense, what is somebody first, anyone who doesn't even know how to fight, what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to put their hands up here, to divide. This is an area of weakness. If you hit my command center, I get knocked out and pass out, right? People will always, by their nature, they will protect their eyes, areas of weakness. When you see the governments, the imperialists, etc., when they go after you for something, it always implies, those are my eyes. That's the command center. I'm protecting the areas of weakness. And when they're trying to protect Zionism right now, it's because Zionism is weaker than ever. It is more aggressive and assertive because of the desperation they have. They have to use all proxies that they have, they're reaching for, all tools, aliens, for God's sake, anything they have to ward off this horrific economic crash that's coming. So they're grabbing the Zionists and they're holding them up like a shield, saying, okay, they're using them like a spear. Let's attack somebody with the Zionists. So right now, Zionism is a critical weapon, but it's also exposed completely. They could hide it. Isn't it amazing how many people were like, before October 7th, I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know about the history, the Palestine. I didn't know the Nakba. I didn't know now. And now that they've in desperation, they've had to wield openly Zionism as a weapon, as a shield, as everything. It has exposed it. And now all of these people are learning about it. And now it's backfiring because people are like, whoa, now that I've learned about this thing, it's really ugly. I think that's the contradiction that they have, the Streisand effect, as it were, where for people who don't know, it was like someone went to Barbara Streisand's house or something like that, and they put it on television. No, this crazy person went to her house, and then everybody said, oh, that's where her house is, and everybody started showing up. It is, and now we've got to stick Zionism out there, and the more people look at Zionism, the more horrified they are. So it is them exposing themselves, exposing Zionism, and exposing their desperation.
Totally, just like the aliens narrative itself, right? So I've posted the link for you, Garland, to have a look at. It's on the crowdjustice.com website, and it's Defend Free Speech is the name of the case that they're crowdfunding for. So they need to reach a certain level of funding, otherwise the crowdfunder just kind of drops and everybody just gets their money given back to them. So they have a short window to raise, I think, £10,000. And, a lot of the work has been done pro bono. That's the one. Brilliant. A lot of the work 50,000, blimey, that's a lot, isn't it? So a lot of the work has been done pro bono. But of course, when you're bringing a case like this in the courts, it's one of the ways that ordinary people are prevented from being represented is that all the mechanisms that are supposedly there for us to access, of course, they cost money. They take time, they take expertise, and they take a whole load of money. And it's very difficult for ordinary people to access that. It's one of the reasons we so often feel so helpless in the face of these things. We're told, oh, yes, well, you can always go to the law. It's like, oh, can we though? Is that right? So there's a very short window to have a judicial review to look at this decision to roll out the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism across the whole NHS, which was just done quietly back last November, right? They didn't announce it. We sort of heard about it and went and had a look, and oh yeah, lo and behold, it sort of says it hidden away on some NHS website. Yes, it has been done. but it wasn't clear to ordinary people. It wasn't, you know, announced loudly, and there was certainly no consultation beforehand. So we've got a small window to try and have a legal case in the High Court, a judicial review, to see if we can get that overturned, and if not, at least bring some publicity and some awareness of ordinary people that this is what's going on, and the way that the state has these mechanisms where they can make something like a law without having to pass it as a law, right? They just get all of the organs of the state to accept that this is the definition of anti-Semitism, and then before you know it, you can be sacked for anti-Semitism according to this definition, because your employer has accepted that this is what anti-Semitism is. And anti-Semitism, according to this definition, is saying anything critical of Israel or of Zionism.
Yes. Well, you know, before we go, I'll add this, and that is that the one of the things, you know, it reminds me, I had a debate one time with this guy at this place, a guy named, a former, I guess, Reagan official named John Sununu, and the argument was, I was saying everybody should have, you know, the government should provide health care. He was going on to say, we've got some of the greatest health care in the world, and, you know, with the cancer treatments, and he went through all of these great things. And I said, you know, in theory, we could have Rolls Royces, but if I can't afford a Rolls Royce, then it's only valuable to the people who can get in one. So we've got very expensive cars, and we've got penthouses that overlook Manhattan and all of these things. But if I can't afford them, I can't get in. And that just reminds me of this, because what he was saying was the illusion of great healthcare, because if you're poor, you don't have any healthcare, much less great healthcare. Well, here, the illusion of the right to petition your government for and seek redress. Yes, you can go to court. Oh, great. You can file lawsuits. Yes, you can do all kinds of things. Yeah, but you got to have 50 grand. Well, I don't have 50 grand. Oh, darn. So they make these things expensive on purpose so they can maintain the illusion of law, the illusion that the average, just little guy in the street can push back, that the working class has options, but they make these options so expensive that even the options are not available to anyone except the ruling elite.
Totally. You know, there's a Victorian novel by Charles Dickens. I'm trying to remember which one it is. I'm going to get it wrong. So sorry to all the listeners. I feel like it's Bleak House, but I might be wrong. Anyway, it's all about litigation and the machinery of litigation under a fully capitalist system where there's no safety net and no social welfare provision, all the rest of it, and the way in which the machinery of the law grinds down the energy and the resources of the people who go to the law. You go to the law trying to get justice, right? And you put all this resource into it, time and money. And at the end of the case, all your time and all your money have been used up, and the only beneficiary really was the law, right? And now that was Dickens was doing a social criticism of what the law was like in those times. And when I was growing up, we had this kind of superior sense that we'd overcome all of that, because of course, legal aid, the right of access for ordinary working class people to the law, was part of the welfare state settlement that we got after World War II. But guess what? As part of dismantling that whole setup, legal aid was also dismantled. It's now almost impossible to get legal aid. There's very, very few cases in which you're eligible, and it's capped. And essentially, it's not much use to you. What the remnants of what's left, and it's all means tested and made incredibly, and only for certain types of cases and all the rest of it. So legal aid has been almost entirely abolished, and increasingly we're back to the days when your access to the law, as you said, Garland, depends on your ability to pay, as with everything else under capitalism, right? Under capitalism, demand, people talk all the time about how brilliant capitalist economics are, because supply and demand is what creates the impetus for production. So it's self-regulating system. Isn't that brilliant? They always tell us, isn't it brilliant? Supply and demand regulate production, and isn't that clever? What they never, ever acknowledge is that demand in a capitalist economy is only considered to exist where a person has money to pay for a good. So if the vast majority of the population of the planet are too poor to pay for something, then there is no demand for that thing, even if the thing is drinking water, right? Clean drinking water. No, there's no demand for that. What do you mean there's no demand? There's no demand in the market capitalist sense because you have to pay for it and those people don't have any money. So there's no demand. In market terms, that's what demand means. Now, it's easy to not understand that if you haven't understood how capitalist economics works, because the terminology sounds a lot like words that you know and use all the time in your life. Of course, there's loads of demand for good, healthy food, isn't there? No, there's no demand. So what do you mean when you say demand? Now, in the capitalist economic sense, it's a very clear and precise meaning. Demand is ability to pay. So yes, the market's brilliant at providing for people's demands, the people who have the money to pay for them. That's why increasingly, the poorer the people get, the more that productive economy or retail economy in the around the world is geared towards a small section of the population that actually has some cash in its pocket. The people who can buy luxuries are extremely well catered for, right? The people who are in desperate need of a shelter over their head, of clean drinking water, of electricity, of food for their children, but who are too poor to pay for those things, they are not catered for at all. That is the insanity, obscenity of capitalist supply and demand, laissez-faire, free market economics. That's how they work.
And when a country such as China takes 800 million people out of poverty, then that's a dictator, the evil dictator, even though over 90% of the people are in favor of their country. You know, when I went to Russia and the economy looks good and everybody has health care and you can go to college and you don't have to pay and blah, blah, blah. And I look at all of that and they're pushing back against the capitalists. And what happens? Oh, they're run by a dictator. You know, Venezuela, which I've been to, when I was there in 2020, I think they were celebrating 300,000 free homes, 300,000 free. Did you know that at the end, one of the great things of Russia, at the end of the when the Soviet Union dissolved, which is a whole nother story, but when it did, you know, a lot of people had houses that the government provided for you. I mean, you know, they had a lot of high rises. They came to everybody and they gave you a deed for your home. So you have a lot of people there who live in an apartment, they own it. And so you have a lot of the home ownership is really, really, well, they don't tell you all those things. So therefore, I think someone told me their electricity bill was $30 a month, $25 a month. You know, I mean, they don't make as much as we do, but actually they have a lot more money because things are, I'm in this gigantic city. If I go to a city that's comparable, would be London or New York. Only both of them, you know, are kind of dirty and loaded with crime, unlike Moscow, but something comparable. But the people in London, New York are right on the edge. And the people there have extra money in their pocket because they're not soaked to the bone for rent. They're not soaked to the bone for, you know, utilities, all those kinds of things that aren't as expensive. It only makes sense that they would kind of like their government more. And of course, that the capitalists would want to destroy their government and steal all that stuff. So
absolutely. And, you know, it's important to recognize that even under the most horrific and genocidally intended sanctions regime, the Venezuelan people over the last 10 years became food secure. They developed food sovereignty from a position where they were importing something 85% of their food. They can now feed their people entirely through their own efforts. They have built up from the grassroots a whole load of new, you know, farming enterprises and are growing 100% of the food that they need to feed their people. And that is a real blow at the imperialist system of control, because a part of the way that they're able to blackmail populations is their ability to strangle them. And that brings us back to this question of, you know, genocide and fascism and never again. This is a genocidal system. The rulers of this system will willingly use murderous genocidal methods to impose their will on populations that don't know their place. And they tried to do it against Venezuela. And one of the reasons that they are trying to issue Venezuela with a punishment beating today is precisely because of how successfully the Venezuelan people were able to stand out against this hybrid warfare that's been non-stop and really intense. You know, it's been non-stop for 26 years, but for the last 10 years, been exceptionally intense. And they really did everything possible to starve the Venezuelan people into submission, and they're mad as hell that that did not work. And just very quickly, if I may, because we're talking about, you know, the incredible feats of the Red Army. It was the Red Army that won the war in Europe. It was the Red Army that defeated the Nazis. It was the Red Army that liberated Leningrad. It was the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz. And of course, it was the socialist system in the USSR, which was the very first to lift huge masses of people out of poverty in a space of time that astonished, absolutely astonished the world, Garland. And people rightfully talk to China's feats of lifting 800 million out of poverty in the last few decades. But in fact, it's not unprecedented. The precedent was the Stalin period of the Soviet Union. They lifted people out of poverty at a rate that had never been seen before, that showed exactly what a planned economy is capable of, the same planned economy that enabled them to go on to defeat the Nazis, that enabled them to industrialize a poor and undeveloped country in the space of a decade, where it was capable of defeating the biggest war machine that the planet has ever seen until that date, the most rabid imperialist force that the planet had ever seen until that date. All of these achievements were because of the planned socialist economy of the Soviet Union and the united will of the Soviet people in building socialism and defending socialism. So I think it's very important to understand that fact. If you really want to defeat fascism, ultimately it's socialism, it's a planned economy, it's a workers' state. Those are the tools we need to bring us past this era of austerity, poverty, war, endless genocides, you know, rabid fascistic rulers trying to gunning us down in the streets for no reason in their attempt to keep us under control. All of these things can be overcome by the united efforts of the people, but it's through uniting to build a socialist alternative is where our real freedom is going to come from.
Thank you, Joti Brar. One last thing I'll let everybody know. We've been saying the German army, by the way, and I didn't really realize until I got there, they're right on the border of Finland. It was the German and the Finns. The Finns it was the Germany, and because right there, you know, what is that, the Bay of Finland or whatever right there. You've got Finland is right next to St. Petersburg. So the army of Finland, the Finns, whatever you call them, the heck, I don't know. But they allied with the Germans. And they came in with the Germans, and they fought they were instrumental in the siege of Leningrad. But they can't let you know that, because then you'll start to find out just how much many other parts of Europe which were allied, and the United States. And then it really gets ugly, and you start to learn that just like Ukraine now, Germany was an imperialist Nazi army that was put together by the British Empire and the US and the French and the rest of them to be thrown at the Soviet Union. And they're doing the same thing with Ukraine today. They only had a few Nazis left, so they saved them in Western Ukraine, and they kind of, you know, nurtured them, shall we say, and they tried to rearm them and give it another shot. And of course, the Russian army did what the Russian army does. Thank you very much, Joti Brar. Tell everybody where they can find you online.
Thank you, Garland. So I have a Telegram channel. It's just my name, Joti Brar. My party has a Telegram channel, The Communists, with an S. That's our website, thecommunist.org. Do sign up for our email newsletter. Do follow us on Telegram. You can see our whole archive of video presentations of all kinds at Proletarian TV on YouTube and all the other video sites. And I would ask people, if you're in Britain, get in touch with us, get involved. It's not good enough just to criticize from the sidelines. We have to be organized. So do get in touch with our party and join us.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to all my Patreon people and everybody who contributes to the channel. And don't forget, please, everyone out there, let's see, we got 458 people, so that should be 458 likes. Make sure you subscribe if you're not subscribed. They check if you are subscribed, because they've been unsubscribing people from the channel without their knowledge. And of course, everyone, share this on all your social media platforms. Thanks very much. We're out.